This is Minister of Finance Ashley Singh presenting Ghana's budget for the 2023 fiscal year. During his presentation, the Honorable Ashley Singh says this.
We recognize that in today's modern age, the ownership of a motor vehicle is no longer considered a luxury, with vehicle ownership improving the ease of access to and from the places of home and of work and of learning, etc. And in this regard, I have the honor to announce on behalf of this People's Progressive Party civic government the following measure to reduce the cost of motor vehicle ownership.
Minister Singh then introduces measures to reduce the cost of car ownership in Ghana, and so I figured let's examine what cars and car dependents actually cost. In a country where we're concerned about cost of living and wages, let's try answering 3 questions. 1. What does car ownership cost an individual? 2. What is the greater cost of car dependence to society? And 3. What, if any, are the alternatives to a car-dependent society? According to studies, the average car owner underestimates how much it costs them to own a car by roughly 52%. We're great at estimating exactly how much gas we use, but the cost of maintenance, insurance, and everything else, not so much. Meet Steve, an average Guyanese public servant. Steve is a young professional living in a young professional housing scheme in, let's say, Providence. He works on Main Street and he makes the average salary of a public servant, $175,000 gross or around $150,000 net. In Guyana, the average cost of a new car is $2.7 million. The average lifespan of a car is 12 years. Work the math, that's $225,000 per year or $18,750 per month just to own a car. That is, of course, assuming there's no bank loan to repay, no compounding interest, and owning the same car for the full 12 years. According to Guyana's laws, Steve must register his car with GRA and he must buy insurance before he can drive it. At the absolute minimum, registration and insurance will cost Steve around $14,000 a year or $1,200 a month. Now Steve owns a registered and insured car, he needs to get from A to B. Unlike my life, unlike this YouTube channel, cars don't run on hopes and dreams, so Steve needs to buy fuel. Depending on the month and how much he drives, Steve spends anywhere between $25,000 and $40,000 on gas alone. Added to that, if he wants to keep his car in good working order, Steve must pay maintenance. According to surveys, car maintenance costs on average between $40 to $60 a month. So let's split the difference and call it $53 or roughly 11,000 Guyanese dollars per month without accounting for any pothole incurred damages. Altogether, Steve is out close to $56,000 every month on the low end simply because he has to drive. Of course, paying for washes, accessorizing, or otherwise personalizing his car would come at an additional cost to Steve, but he can avoid those. What Steve can't avoid, though, are the indirect costs of car ownership that he also pays. Car dependence contributes to a sedentary lifestyle. While he was using public transportation, Steve had to walk from his house to a bus stop, from the bus stop to his office. Now, though, that Steve drives, he only walks from his house to the car, from the car to the office. Additionally, persons in car-dependent societies experience increased levels of personal stress due to road rage and driving under congested conditions. This leads to a strong correlation between car dependence in a society and obesity and cardiovascular health. Individuals in car-centric societies also suffer more severely the impacts of environmental degradation through air, noise, and water pollution. Cars also create isolation between driver and community, and also between communities owing to low-density land use. The isolation is not limited to drivers, but non-drivers as well. Because car infrastructure, especially highways, represent a significant obstacle to everyone outside of a car, highways and pedestrian unfriendly major roads, either intentionally or otherwise, further social divides when placed within cities and neighborhoods. This separation created between persons, as well as between persons and their environment, can negatively impact mental health. While the direct costs of car ownership are more easily identifiable with individuals, the indirect costs are often easier to see when viewing society as a whole. The first obvious way car dependence affects society, the environmental impact. The average gas car emits 4.6 tons of CO2 per year. When every citizen is forced to drive, the problem multiplies. Emissions are normally thought of as the only way that cars impact the environment, and so EVs are touted as the solution. However, there are other environmental impacts of car dependence that EVs will not solve. Firstly, cars need roads to drive on and places to park. The production of asphalt and concrete for roads and other car infrastructure is itself a significant source of emissions. These surfaces, especially dark asphalt, are good at absorbing and reflecting heat. This makes urbanized areas significantly warmer than their surroundings, creating urban heat islands. The urban heat island effect is not the only result of these surfaces. Asphalt and concrete surfaces create an impervious barrier to water when rains and storms occur. This decreases drainage and increases the likelihood of flooding in significantly urbanized areas. Finally, the runoff from these surfaces can cause water pollution. Because oil and grease from cars and garbage, etc., that may be present in urban areas can be washed away, they represent significant water pollutant hazards. Car dependence also promotes urban sprawl. Since cars take up so much space, everything must be spread further and further apart. This sprawl necessitates more car infrastructure, and so emphasizes production emissions, urban heat island effects, surface runoff, and all other negative aspects of being dependent on cars for transportation. Encouraging and enforcing car dependence, therefore, contributes directly to accelerating climate change, which is already a significant threat to Guyana's continued existence. Throughout all time, across all cultures, there has never been a means of transportation that destroys its own required infrastructure faster than the car. From neighborhood streets to main streets to highways, car use destroys them all. While streets have always been necessary for as long as people have lived in cities, dependence on cars accelerates their degradation. Every year, billions of dollars in the budget is allocated to expanding and maintaining roads, and yet dodge the pothole is still a Guyanese sport on a daily basis. This isn't necessarily the fault of poor quality roads, or poor construction, or contractors cutting corners, though we should probably ask questions about why the Grove Road needs fixing every 2 months. It is a fundamental aspect of car dependence that roads are destroyed by the cars that use them. Given a population of roughly 800,000 people and a budget allocation of $136.1 billion, road infrastructure alone will cost the Guyanese government $170,000 per citizen, and that's just this year. Roads will need expanding and maintaining next year as well, and every year to come. Apart from the inherent unsustainability of car infrastructure is the other obvious problem. Roads take up space, lots of it. The relationship between car dependence and space dedicated to road infrastructure is pretty well understood. The more cars, the more space for infrastructure. Roads aren't the only space problem though. Where do we put all our cars when we're not using them? Of course, in parking lots. The average size of a parking space is 144 square feet. Let's say in all of Georgetown, there were only 5,000 parking spaces. That would mean that 16.5 acres of land, which sits empty for the majority of the day, is wasted on just free parking. Land that could be used for agriculture or housing or anything else is just committed to serving only drivers, and only for small portions of the day. By the way, I'm not suggesting we start charging for parking, especially not at ridiculously inflated prices. We've seen how well that worked out last time we tried it. In 2021, the Guyana Police Force recorded 362 serious accidents, which resulted in 397 injuries and 99 deaths. Extrapolating based on GDP per capita, road fatalities in the same year cost Guyana $1 million. But wait, I know what you're going to say. That's not the way to make that point. That's not an accurate way of measuring costs. That's just messed up. In 2004, Dr. Gaugran Boudou, instructed by the Ministry of Public Works and Communication, conducted research into the cost of road fatalities in Guyana. His study found for every death there was an associated cost of $60,000 while an injury had an attached cost of $7,500. Adjusting for inflation and plugging in 2021 figures, car dependence costs Guyana $3 billion annually. Serious accidents and road fatalities are on the rise in Guyana, and so for 2023, there has been a 100% increase in serious accidents over 2022, which had similar numbers to 2021. Of course, there is no monetary cost that could adequately compensate for a life lost, and so the true cost of car dependence in lives is immeasurable. What is measurable, though, and what data collected around the world shows, is this. The more car dependent a society is, the higher the incidence of road fatalities. Further investment into car dependence is paying money today for funerals tomorrow. An often overlooked aspect of mandatory car ownership is the role it plays in perpetuating and expanding poverty in a society. In 2014, a Harvard study came to the following conclusion. Access to transportation is the single most important factor in an individual's ability to escape poverty. If an individual in poverty cannot readily, predictably, and reliably move from point A where they live to point B where either better educational opportunities or better paying jobs are, that individual is significantly more likely to remain impoverished than someone with secure transportation. In light of that, in a society where car ownership is mandatory, either through incentivizing it or neglecting public transportation, poverty thrives. Let's check in on our friend Steve again. Of his average public service salary of $149,800 net, Steve must pay $56,000 per month on the low end, or 32% of his salary, to own and drive his car. Except, I lied. The average salary of a public servant in Guyana in 2022, according to the Bureau of Statistics, was actually closer to $132,000. This means that at $56,000 per month, car ownership costs 42% of the average gross salary of a public servant. For a worker earning the public sector minimum wage or the private sector minimum wage, car ownership is impossible. For every citizen who can't afford $56,000 per month to own a private car, the only option is Guyana's sucky and barely existing public transportation system. Productivity is also sacrificed in a car-dependent society. Let's check back in with our friend Steve. Now that he's driving, Steve has to commute from his home to town in rush hour traffic, and hopefully it only takes him an hour to and an hour from. During his commute, because he is driving, Steve can only drive. No relaxation, no catching up on reading, no replying to emails, just driving. Going off his salary and the amount of time worked per month, Steve's commute alone costs $43,750 per month in lost time and productivity. Multiply that to account for all the people that commute into Georgetown daily, and traffic costs Guyana's economy, in one city alone, more than $1 billion in lost productivity. $1 billion every month. When considering how government subsidize car dependence, fuel is an easy place to start looking. Price shocks started in 2022 saw fuel prices increase dramatically, and because in car-dependent societies, consumers are particularly vulnerable to price shocks, government took steps to mitigate the impact. The excise tax, usually allocated with the importation of gasoline, diesel, and hydrocarbon fuels, was removed. In 2023, the government of Guyana estimates that maintaining the zero excise tax rating on fuel will cost $17 billion. Currently in Guyana, there are no toll roads and only 3 tolled bridges. This means that outside of these bridges, driving in Guyana is completely free, and using road infrastructure incurs no cost and generates no direct revenue. Because road maintenance and expansion is necessary in any country, we can't count the entire $136 billion allocation as a subsidy. Import duties, excise tax on cars, taxes on the sale of automotive parts are some of the ways in which government makes revenue directly from drivers. If we assume revenue collected directly from drivers through these sources accounts for 70% of this allocation, which it doesn't, then the other 30%, or 41 billion, can be said to be a direct subsidy towards car infrastructure. Counting $41 billion in infrastructure, $17 billion in fuel subsidies, plus $12 billion in lost productivity, $3 billion in lost lives, Ghana's economy loses at least $73 billion every year due to car dependence. If car dependence doesn't actually make lives in cities better, if car ownership doesn't mark development, then what does? What actually helps reduce traffic in cities, reduce road fatalities, and reduce the burden of cars? In recent years, the term 15-minute city has gotten quite popular. It's a concept that, put simply, means everything someone could need in a city should be within 15 minutes of where they live. This includes their schools, their jobs, recreational spaces, supermarkets, everything. Because cars and parking lots tend to accommodate and promote urban sprawl, 15-minute cities are instead centered around walkability, cycling, and transit as mobility options. These are the opposite of car dependence. The combination of walkable cities, good cycling infrastructure, and good public transportation gets people out of cars and reduces the impact of car dependence on cities. Even in Ghana, there has been talk of 15-minute cities. Silica City, the new planned city, is meant to be a 15-minute city, and though we're yet to hear about specific plans to make the city walkable, cyclable, or even public transportation plans, here's to hoping Silica City doesn't become a car-dependent hell like the rest of the Eastbound Corridor. Now, I know what some counter-arguments are going to be. But Ghana's too hot or too rainy for cycling to work or school to be a regular thing. Except it's not. Cycling was much more common in Ghana in years past than it is now, and it's even popular in places with similar temperature and climate to Guyana. The fact is, cycling is what we did, and it can be what we do again. Another common counter-argument to disincentivizing cars is, but I like my car, I love driving. If you love driving, you should also advocate for more modes of transportation. Let's go back to Steve and hypotheticals one last time. If there were attractive alternatives to driving, such that half of the persons living on the Eastbound Corridor chose not to drive and instead used those other modes, driving gets infinitely better for Steve. Less cars on the road means Steve spends less time sitting in traffic and more time actually doing what he likes, which is driving. Less cars means less time wasted in traffic jams, less gas used, less deterioration of road infrastructure, less potholes, and less road rage. Diversifying transportation away from cars improves every transportation metric, even for drivers. It's better for the environment, it's better for productivity, better for the local economy, it reduces accidental death, and it contributes to a healthier society, both physically and socially. Car dependence is an addiction that will, quite literally, kill us. Looking as a whole, $672,000 in individual costs annually, $170,000 per person in maintenance cost, billions in lost productivity, and the immense cost in lives should be far too steep a price to pay for moving from point A to point B. Incentivizing car dependence and suburban sprawl cannot go hand in hand with improving lives today, building prosperity for tomorrow. Those things are mutually exclusive. We don't have to make the same mistakes ourselves. As Guyanese say, easy lesson good for dunce. Will we learn from the cities that built car dependence and quickly reversed course once they realized it creates more problems than it solves? Or will we learn from those cities that maxed out car dependence and continuously double down saying, just one more lane bro, all I need is one more lane? We'll end with this quote. A developed country is not one where everyone can afford a car, it's one where the rich take public transportation. If we ignore the cost of car dependence, if we continue to invest in what has proven to be economically wasteful, just so we can say everyone in this country can afford a car, we're actively deciding to make our future worse, all for the sake of a very fleeting now.